This week I was scrolling through popular sweater patterns on Ravelry and I noticed something I didn't expect, because out of the 15 most popular sweater patterns right now, 9 are created by Danish designers like PetiteKnit. So the Scandinavian aesthetic is clearly dominating right now. But here's what I started wondering. Are these sweaters actually as simple to knit as most of them look at first glance? So today I am ranking the 15 most popular sweater knitting patterns on Ravelry from easiest to hardest to see which of those Scandinavian favorites are actually beginner friendly and which of them might require a bit more experience than you might expect. At level 1 we have the Step-by-Step sweater by Florence Miller, and this one definitely earns its name. It is designed specifically as a beginner project and features a very classic raglan construction and is knitted from the top down, which is one of the easiest sweater constructions there is. It is also knitted with all over stockinette stitch, and since it is knitted from the top down, like I mentioned, you can easily try it on as you go and adapt the length of both the body and the sleeves to your preferences. The shaping is straightforward and the instructions are extremely detailed. Florence Miller also includes a lot of guidance throughout the pattern, so if this is your very first sweater, you're not left guessing what to do next. And in addition, this pattern comes with a full video tutorial here on YouTube, which I'm going to link for you in the description box below, along with everything else that I'm mentioning in this video. So if you have never knitted a sweater before, this is probably one of the most safest places to start. And this pattern is even available for free, which is always great. Coming in at level 2 is another free pattern and one that is very well known, the Flex Worsted by PetiteKnit. This is also another top-down raglan construction, which is easy to understand and very straightforward. What makes the flex sweater slightly more interesting is the garter stitch panel on the sleeves, which adds a bit of texture while still being very beginner friendly. The pattern comes from PetiteKnit's Simple collection, which was designed to teach knitters the fundamentals of pattern construction, and every pattern in this collection is available for free. So while this one is still very approachable, it adds just a little bit more variety compared to the Step-by-Step sweater. At level 3 we have the No Frills sweater by PetiteKnit, and this design perfectly represents the Scandinavian minimalist aesthetic. Looking at the construction, it appears to be rather similar than the other two sweaters. It is also knitted from the top down in all over stockinette stitch and features a raglan construction. Technically, it's still quite simple. However, PetiteKnit patterns often assume that the knitter already has some basic experience, so the instructions tend to be a bit more concise compared to beginner-focused patterns. And that's something to keep in mind for Danish knitting patterns in general. They are just not as detailed as, let's say, a pattern from an American designer. Another factor that moved this pattern slightly up the difficulty scale is that this sweater is often knit with a silk mohair yarn held together with a wool yarn, which creates that soft halo, but it can make tension slightly harder to control. This design also features German short rows to shape the neckline, which improves the fit of the garment, but is a new technique that some more beginner knitters maybe have not encountered yet. So overall, a very approachable construction, but the execution requires just a little bit more confidence. And at level 4 we have another PetiteKnit design, the Monday sweater. This sweater looks very similar to the No Frills sweater at first glance. It's oversized, it has this raglan construction and an all over stockinette stitch. And it's also knitted with a combination of a fingering weight yarn held together with a strand of a silk mohair yarn. But there is a subtle detail that makes it slightly more involved. You knit a folded over collar and sew it down on the inside of the fabric so it creates this double neckband. The shaping is still very manageable. It just adds one step in the overall construction of the garment, but overall still very doable. At level 5 we have the cloud sweater, another design by PetiteKnit. At first glance this also looks rather simple, but it introduces a bit more of an unusual construction. You start at the back neck and shape it with short rows, then work each shoulder separately before joining everything in the round to form the front yoke. At the end you pick up stitches for the funnel neck, which is worked in stockinette stitch and allowed to roll naturally. The same rolling edge appears at the hem and the cuffs. So this is still done in all over stockinette stitch, but the construction is just a little bit more unusual, and this is why it sits at level 5. So now that we have covered the very beginner-friendly sweaters, we are moving into more of what I would consider the confident beginner territory. And the first design that we are going to have a look at is the blouse number 1 by My Favorite Things Knitwear. Overall, a very clean silhouette, but if you compare this design to the previous sweaters, you will notice that this is a bit more of a fitted design compared to the more oversized fits we just saw. And since it is more fitted, the gauge accuracy becomes more important. This sweater is also knitted from the top down, and the yoke and sleeves are worked using the contiguous method here for a seamless finish and a satin sleeve look. And in addition, the sweater is knitted with 2 strands of a 100% silk yarn held together. And since silk has a lot less give than a wool yarn, some knitters find it less pleasant to work with. Similar to the cloud sweater we just had a look at, the edging on the neckline, sleeve cuffs and bottom hem is also simply worked in stockinette stitch, which means it naturally rolls in on itself. So while the techniques themselves are still very manageable, the finished results depend more on precision and consistency, and that's why I placed it at level 6. The next sweater introduces a slightly different design philosophy, and it is the Lakes pullover by Ozeda, also known as Hayley Smedley. Ozeda's designs are known for their relaxed fit, and they are often designed to be true wardrobe staples, and the Lakes pullover beautifully fits in this design aesthetic. The construction itself is still very straightforward, but the pattern requires a bit more awareness of shaping and garment structure than the beginner sweaters earlier on the list. The sweater is worked from the top down and features a saddle shoulder construction as well as a double folded collar, and it also relies on a very clean stockinette fabric. So while it's not technically complex, it benefits from a knitter who feels comfortable navigating pattern instructions independently. Another sweater that sits right around this level of difficulty is the Cumulus blouse by PetiteKnit. Like the cloud sweater we just had a look at earlier, it's typically knit using 2 strands of lace weight mohair held together, which creates that very soft and airy fabric. The construction itself is still relatively straightforward, but the V-neck shaping and I-cord finishing add a few additional techniques that beginners might not have tried yet. But overall, it's also knitted from the top down and in all over stockinette, and that's why the Cumulus blouse is placed at this level. Now, as we move further up the difficulty scale, the next designs are going to introduce additional techniques or design elements. And here we have the Olga sweater, also by PetiteKnit. This sweater also looks rather simple and straightforward at first glance, and it features a very classic sweater construction. This time it is a drop shoulder design. What makes this design slightly more involved though is the striped pattern across the body and the sleeves. Working stripes may sound simple, but it does require careful color management and tension consistency, especially when you're carrying yarn along the side of the work or weaving in multiple ends at the end. That's especially important for the first portion of the sweater that is knitted flat before you join to knit in the round once you've knitted below the point of the underarms. So while the construction itself still remains very approachable, the additional step in managing the stripe pattern is what moves the Olga sweater slightly up the difficulty scale. Now the next sweater takes us slightly up the difficulty scale because it introduces a couple of construction techniques that need you to pay a bit more attention to your knitting. And this is the Storm Sweater by PetiteKnit, which again at first glance has this very classic minimal Scandinavian aesthetic to it. But the Storm Sweater features more defined structural elements around the shoulders and neckline, which makes the construction slightly more involved than a simple raglan sweater, let's say. It's worked from the top down, starting with a back neck that is shaped using short rows, and it features a drop shoulder construction. And in addition, the Storm Sweater introduces alternating textured sections created by knits and purls, 4 different sections in total. So it is still very manageable for knitters who might have maybe knitted a sweater or 2 before, but compared to the simpler raglan constructions we had a look at previously, I think this construction requires just a bit more attention and precision, and that's why I placed the Storm Sweater at level 9. We are definitely moving into solid intermediate territory now. And here we have the Field Sweater by Camilla Well. I hope I pronounced that correctly. If not, please let me know. Camilla is known for her beautiful nature-inspired designs, and the Field Sweater introduces this beautiful textured pattern on the yoke. Yoke patterns introduce a few additional challenges. So you're often working from charts or detailed stitch instructions, and you need to maintain both the pattern and the shaping at the same time. This sweater features a circular yoke construction, which means you are increasing at different points throughout the yoke while maintaining this beautiful grain pattern. This requires a bit more knitting experience, especially when it comes to keeping the pattern aligned correctly across the sweater. But once you are past the textured yoke, the rest is done in very simple all-over stockinette stitch. The next sweater is incredibly popular and it is often recommended to adventurous beginners, but technically it does introduce some new challenges. I'm talking about the Love Notes by Tinker Knits, and it is this beautiful pattern with this lace motif on the yoke that looks very light and airy. Lace knitting involves yarn overs and decreases that must align correctly to create the intended pattern. And on top of that, this sweater is often knitted with an added strand of a silk mohair yarn or another fluffy yarn, which can make it more difficult to see the stitches clearly. This is another circular yoke construction that is knitted from the top down. So while the overall construction is still very manageable, the added lace section is what pushes this design into more intermediate territory. Next, we have one of the most iconic patterns on Ravelry, the Ranunculus by Midori Hirose. This pattern is known for its very loose gauge and oversized fit, which creates this very airy and relaxed look of the pattern. But knitting at such a loose gauge can actually be rather tricky because maintaining even tension becomes more challenging, and the lace details around the neckline require careful attention as well, especially if you're knitting with a silk mohair yarn. Because of the combination of lace, unusual gauge, and fabric behavior, the ranunculus can be surprisingly challenging to execute well. Now that we are entering the final stretch of this ranking, the sweaters that are placed here contain various techniques that require a solid knitting experience. At level 14, we have the Salty Day sweater by Veronika Lindberg, and what stands out when looking at this sweater is the all-over texture on the complete garment that consists of lace, cables, and ribbing. Unlike simpler lace patterns that appear only in the yoke, the different textured sections here are integrated into the structure of the garment, which means you need to keep track of multiple stitch patterns. The sweater also alternates between ribbing, cable, and lace panels, like I mentioned, so maintaining consistent tension across those different fabrics becomes important for the final look. And another factor that increases the complexity is the yarn combination, because you hold a strand of a lace weight silk mohair together with a DK weight yarn, and that creates a beautiful soft fabric, but it can make stitches slightly harder to read while you're knitting. And because of these different factors, it definitely sits more towards the advanced end of this ranking. But you are rewarded with a sweater that creates a lot of visual interest, and it also comes with a full video tutorial here on YouTube, which of course also makes it a bit easier to execute. And finally, the most technically demanding sweater in this ranking, we have the Porcelain Damask sweater by Lene Holme Samsø, also known as Le Knit. This sweater introduces a new technique because it is a colorwork design, and when knitting colorwork you have to manage different strands of yarn and keeping special attention to the tension of your fabric. You also need to manage floats on the inside of the garment and ensure the colorwork pattern remains balanced and consistent. This is a drop shoulder construction that is knitted from the top down, and this means that you need to knit the first part of the sweater flat until you've reached the point of the underarms where you can join in the round. And knitting colorwork flat is not an easy thing to do. That's why this sweater requires the most experience out of the designs in this list. But for knitters who enjoy stranded colorwork, this can be an incredibly satisfying project to knit, and it is indeed a very beautiful pattern. Now, in case you have noticed, I am actually wearing a sweater that looks a bit similar to the porcelain sweater, and this is more or less its sibling. It is also a design by Lene Holme Samsø called the Porcelain Damask sweater, and it also consists of these different sections and has a very similar construction, but contrary to the porcelain sweater, this is done. The different sections are created by simple knits and purls, so it is a lot easier to knit than the porcelain sweater. You might have noticed something interesting when watching this ranking. A lot of the sweaters we have had a look at share a very similar design aesthetic. Minimal shaping, clear lines, and this overall Scandinavian design aesthetic. But as you could clearly see, although most of the sweaters look very simple at first glance, they vary widely in difficulty. And I hope this ranking gave you a chance to see where you fall on that difficulty scale and that you can choose your next sweater knitting project with confidence. Happy knitting, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye!